Welcome to Plymouth, America's hometown. Established in 1620 by the Pilgrims who came here from England. And it's America's hometown because we set the building blocks for the country we have today. And to understand that, we need to understand who these Pilgrims are and where they came from. The Pilgrims had a little problem back in England in the 1600s with a gentleman by the name of King James. Now, King James was the King of England and the head of the Anglican Church. So when King James set the law in England, he set the law for everybody. Everybody in England set the same rule of law, except King James. He was above the law. He didn't have to follow his own law. Not only that, if you belonged to his church, the Anglican Church, and you wanted to pray, knock your lights out, pray all day long, as long as the subject of your prayer was King James. He thought he was God, divine right of kings. Well, that kind of rubbed our pastor the wrong way. John Robinson, the pastor of the Pilgrims, took his folks out of the Anglican Church and they had church in their homes. In other words, the Pilgrims separated from the Church of England. That's why we're called separatists. See, there was another group back then, theologically similar to the Pilgrims, who stayed in the Anglican Church and tried to purify it from within. We call them the Puritans. They came 10 years later and founded Boston. But this is a very big difference. Because when John Robinson did that, separated from the church, he never wanted to see one person in charge of everything ever again, like the king. So he had his congregation elect him pastor, not appoint him. Appoint him, you can't get rid of him. Elect him, you can dump him. But you know what that did for us? That started self-rule in our country. The result, the Mayflower Compact. First document to self-rule, we elected John Carver, the first really elected official in the United States, all based on the fact that Robinson never wanted to see one person in charge of everything ever again. Of course, we have to ask this question. Where in the world did John Robinson come up with this self-rule thing in the first place? Back then there was no self-rule, everything was tyrannical. Well, he came up with it when he started reading the Bible. And in the Old Testament, he came across a little passage called the Dominion Charter. We're to take dominion over the earth, over the animals, birds, fish, things that creep and crawl. But he also read this, not each other. You see, Robinson read we're all made in the image of God. Well, his thinking was if we're all made in the image of God, then no human being has a right to be above another human being without their consent. Self-rule civil government is a biblical principle. You cannot have civil government without biblical law. And that brings us back to another point. When the Pilgrims separated from the Church of England, they started having church in their homes, illegally. And they had the church in a home in Scrooby, England. And when they did that, they wrote a covenant one to another called the Scrooby Covenant, which said we will honor each other, love each other under God with Jesus Christ as King, and we will do it voluntarily. Nobody forcing us to do it. See, in King James's church, you had to belong to his church. That was the law. You had to worship him as God. But in this church, you could voluntarily belong to the church, but if you belong to the church, follow the rules. Simple. Love God, love your neighbor, love yourself. We make a covenant one to another to honor one another under Jesus Christ and to proclaim him. And that was the Scrooby Covenant, and that pulled these people together to form this church, which, of course, they were persecuted in doing. So now what happens there is because of that, they're forced out of England, go to Holland where they could worship freely, and they were in Holland for 12 years. 12 years later, they came here and started a colony here. Now, why didn't they just stay in Holland? They could worship freely because they couldn't do other things freely. They couldn't set up their own economic system. They were foreigners. They couldn't get good jobs. They worked 15 hours a day, barely to make it by. But I will tell you this, they worked so hard and were so honest. They would be hired by the people in Holland before anybody else because of their reputation of hard work and honesty. But nonetheless, they were breaking down. And now we're in Holland, English people, and we're trying to teach our children the way of the English, the British way. We're trying to teach them land ownership, how to work with your father, how to build a society, how to be honest. And we're trying to do that, but we can't do that because we're working all this time and we can't move from one place to another without this work. Now our children are working just as hard and they're breaking down. And to be honest, they're losing their Christian identity. Some are going off on boats to earn a living. They're breaking away from the family. Something had to be done. So they said they're going to come to the New World, and they came to America. Now, when they came to America, as they got on the boat, there were two different groups of people on the boat. One, the separatists, us Pilgrims, and another one called the strangers, who were coming for other reasons, mostly economic. So now you've got two different groups of people on the boat, and not at all like-minded. The strangers weren't happy with the Christian abilities of the saints. And when they came here, they landed in Plymouth, but this is not where they were supposed to land. They were supposed to land in Northern Virginia. They missed the mark by 200 miles. And what they had was a patent or a law from the king to be in Virginia, but none to be at Cape Cod. So they had to write their own law. And they wrote that law, and we call that the Mayflower Compact. The Mayflower Compact is another covenant under God that they would form a civil body politic with God in charge. God is king, not a king on earth. God is king. And we would worship God, not worship King James. Just like John Robinson formed elections for his church, we now formed elections for the leaders. And the leaders were elected by the people. See, in England, the power structure went from God to the people, from God to the king to the people. The king thinking he's God's representative on earth. Now, when we write the Mayflower Compact, that changes. The power structure now goes from God to the people to the king or the people in charge. And now the people in charge are servants to the people, not the people servant to them. Which means what? It means if I break the same law Governor William Bradford breaks, we both get the same punishment because we're equal under the same law. It also means that every year we have an election. And if I don't like the way that leader's behaving the next year, I can unelect him. See, now the responsibility is ours. To have a civil government, we have to have the responsibility of putting the people in office that have character, integrity, and virtue. And if we do not do that, we will not have or keep a civil government. See, the civil government has to be formed on the law of God, biblical law. Because if it's not, if the people make the law, if I make the law, you're not going to like it. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the law today. And next week I'll change it in my favor. But you can't change God's law without that constant, without that truth. You cannot have a civil government. And all comes under the umbrella of a covenant. If I'm looking at the Bible, and the Bible is my textbook for life, I am going to follow the Bible. I'm going to follow the Bible about my politics, about my family, and my economics. See, now when the Pilgrims originally came to Plymouth, their economic situation was communal. That means that everybody at the plantation worked in the same field and grew their food, and at the end of the season, they simply evenly split with each other what they produced. Sounds fair enough, and of course it didn't work. You see, if I were to go out in the field of work, and you went out in the field of work, and I didn't work hard and you did, well, I'd still get the same amount that you got. It wasn't equal under the law. Now, if I were left to produce on my own, however much I could on the land that I owned, then I would be much more productive. Because if I'm going to not get a reward for my hard work, I'm not going to be as productive. And I don't care who you are, Christian, non-Christian, people are people. And if we get held back, we're going to resent it. Now, for example, I'm old and I'm handicapped. And if I were at the plantation and somebody went up to a young man and said, "Hey, young man, go over there and give your stuff to that old guy because he can't work and he's handicapped," that young man would resent it. And I don't care who you are. You'd resent that because you don't not like being told what to do with your stuff. On the other hand, if he were left alone to produce and produce as much as he wanted, I'd be willing to bet he would voluntarily help the old man out. Because now he's not being told what to do with his stuff. And he's allowed to freely produce as much as he can. See, guys, it kind of breaks down to this. Land ownership. People come to see me and they say the Pilgrims stole the land from the Indians. They did not. Keep in mind, before the Indians came here, hunters would come from Europe, hunt and go back home. On occasion, they would invite Indians aboard their ships to trade with them, capture them as slaves, and take them back to Europe. One of those Indians' name was Squanto. Squanto was a Pawtuxet Indian. Now, Pawtuxet means small river. They were named after the river behind me here. Of course, we had another tribe back then called the Wampanoag, Chief Massasoit. That's who everybody talks about, but we did have the Pawtuxet Indians. Now, what happened with the Pawtuxet Indians? Well, these hunters came from Europe, and they grabbed Squanto as a slave and took him back to Europe. He escaped to a monastery, learned English. 6 months later, he comes back on another ship to find out that the Pawtuxet Indians were wiped out by a plague, his tribe. He went into mourning with Massasoit and the Wampanoag. 6 months later, the Pilgrims arrived. He became the interpreter between the Pilgrims and the Indians. That is the only way they could communicate. Governor William Bradford referred to him as a special gift from God. Now, why do I bring this up? I bring it up because when people say we stole the land from the Indians, that is not true. When we arrived here, the whole tribe had been wiped out. The land was empty, and nobody else would come on it because of the plague that killed those Indians. So the Pilgrims took land nobody wanted. Everything after that, they paid for it to the Chief Massasoit. Now, why is this so important? Because if we cannot own land, we have absolutely no power. Whoever owns the land we do business on will be our master. We will be their slave. We have to have the ability to own land. And once we own that land, whatever we produce on that land is ours. We produced it with our own hands, with our own work, with our own effort. You see, the bottom line on land is this. Who really owns the land? The Creator. Whoever created that land owns it, and the Creator is God. He is gracious enough to loan us a portion of that land for us to produce as best we can for Him and for other people. You see, folks, work is worship. We're worshiping God by our hard work and by how we treat other people and how we love one another. As long as we do this and we follow the number one commandment, love God, love your neighbor, love yourself, then we're okay. Everything's going to be fine. But once we don't do that, once we are not able to own land, once we are told what to do with our stuff, we lose our freedoms and we lose our ability to grow and we lose our ability to worship God. You see, our liberties come from God. You can't be freer than if you're a Christian, because under God, you have total freedom. See, it doesn't matter what somebody does to me here on earth. I know where I'm going. I'm good. I have this freedom in Christ. That's beyond any understanding, and I'm good with that. But for us to have freedom and liberty in our country, we have to stay under biblical law. We have to stay under the covenant. You see, the covenant helps us have order. God's a God of order. And when you keep God in the picture, you have order. When you start to remove God from the picture, you're going to have chaos. And I'll tell you what. See, what happens when you remove God from being God? And you put something else in, because something has to fill the gap. So once you remove God from being God, what's going to fill the gap? Well, what filled the gap with King James was the government, the state. Now the state became God, and the state wanted you to worship it. And that's what's happening today. As we move away from the covenant with God that we have, the Mayflower Compact, we're finding chaos. Did you notice a little chaos? We've got to put God back on His throne and put the law of God back in its place. And then we don't have chaos. Then we keep our liberties, because once somebody else puts themselves as God, the state, they start calling the shots. They tell you what you can have, what you can do, what you can't do, what you can produce, where you live, and that will change weekly to make power for them. So folks, if you want to be honest about it, we have to have the commitment the Pilgrims had when they came here, when they committed themselves to that covenant under God. See, 102 Pilgrims came on the Mayflower and 51 died the first winter. Down here in Plymouth, we have a little statue called the Pilgrim Mother, a statue representing the 18 married women that came on the Mayflower. When we originally left Europe, we had two ships, one called the Speedwell, one called the Mayflower. We owned the Speedwell, we leased the Mayflower. Speedwell picked our friends up in Holland, brought them to England, met the Mayflower, and came over. When they left England, the Speedwell leaked twice. They had to sell it for half what they paid for it, lost their investment. 20 of the original passengers had to stay behind, and they left late. When they landed on the tip of Cape Cod, they had run out of food. The men looked around the Cape, found a stash of corn buried in the ground by the Indians, and they took it. They did not steal the corn, they borrowed it. They paid it back later. Had they not taken the corn, they never would have survived. Because you see, by the end of that first winter, they were doling out a quarter pound of cornbread per person per day to survive on. So as you can well imagine, the mothers took their bread and fed their children. They covered their children with their own bodies to keep them warm. Of those 18 married women, 14 died the first winter, sacrificing themselves for the next generation, knowing if they did not survive, we would not survive. And written on the back of that statue, it says they brought their families in a sturdy virtue. And a sturdy virtue. And a feeling in God that they would not turn back from their covenant. See, at the end of that first season, when the Mayflower got ready to go back to England, Captain Jones turned to the 51 remaining Pilgrims and he said to them, "I want you back on my ship. I'm taking you home. I can't leave you here." Not one got back on. But I will tell you this. When that boat disappeared over the horizon, those 51 remaining Pilgrims fell on their knees and they wept. The last bit of civilization, as they knew it, just disappeared. That is a covenant commitment. To stay under God and follow His purposes. And our job now is to pass that to the next generation. I told you we signed a peace treaty with Massasoit, the chief of the Wampanoag. We signed that peace treaty 3 years after the signing of the peace treaty. Massasoit was at his camp in Rhode Island. The man had the plague, he was dying. A gentleman from Plymouth by the name of Edward Winslow walked to Rhode Island to nurse Massasoit back to health. Winslow walked 40 miles. Halfway there, he was met on a path by an Indian who told him not to bother finishing the trip. Massasoit died. Well, he finished the trip anyway, and he discovered Massasoit had not yet died. He was very close, and Ed Winslow nursed him back to health. From that day forward, they were great friends, and that peace treaty was even stronger. Now we'll move ahead 50 years. 50 years later, we had the King Philip War. Then Philip was not a European. He was Massasoit's son. His Christian name was Philip. He went to negotiate not to go to war with the governor, then governor of Plymouth, Josiah Winslow, Edward Winslow's son. Edward Winslow was once governor of Plymouth. Philip looks at Winslow and says, "Hey, I'm a chief. You're just a governor. I'm not going to talk to you. I'll only talk to kings." They broke off the negotiations and went to war. From that day forward, Philip was referred to as King Philip because he would only talk to kings. And the two men that became great friends, their two sons, went to war a generation later. That biblical Education did not get passed down to that generation. And what is the result? The largest percentage of population was killed in the King Philip War than any war in our country's history. And it could have been stopped. That's how important education is. That's how important of us passing to the next generation what they need to know so they can pass it to the next and to the next. Otherwise, our history will be removed and we will not be able to honor God's covenant. And we will lose our country. Thank you for listening.